Since everything has a beginning, what were the first creatures to live on Earth? It's just one of many seemingly unanswerable questions. Since the appearance of life 3.8 billion years ago, life on our planet has remained in the state of a simple organism for billions of years, until the first complex forms of life appeared. If you've ever heard of the Cambrian explosion, you'll know that it's an intriguing phenomenon due to the huge diversification of life. Even though before the Cambrian, there were virtually no multicellular animals. For a very long time, the transition from the Precambrian microbiotic world to the appearance of the Cambrian fauna remained a mystery. So what happened between the Precambrian and the Cambrian? Dear traveler, welcome. Today, we're off to discover the landscapes of the distant past, a panorama rich in strange creatures and impacted by events that shaped our world long before the appearance of mankind. But before you set off on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you, and have a great trip. It's 1946 in Ediacara, a mountainous region in South Australia, where we discover well-preserved fossils buried in rock strata dating back hundreds of millions of years and belonging to no known geological era. This exploration is full of surprises. At first glance, there's nothing special about the rocks of Ediacara, except that they tell the story of the Earth in chronological order. Thanks to these rocks, we've been able to echo the questions that have remained unanswered until now, notably those linked to the origin of life on Earth. In the meantime, analyses are being carried out to pinpoint the exact era of the geological formations and determine the age of the newly discovered fossils. It should be noted that similar organisms had already been spotted elsewhere before, but at the time they were attributed without much conviction to the Cambrian fauna. Stratigraphic, paleontological, relative, and radiometric dating studies combined with examinations of the organisms discovered at Ediacara revealed that they did not originate from the Cambrian, but rather from an earlier period. The chemical composition, texture, and stratification of the rocks clearly indicated that the geological formations examined dated from 635 to 541 million years BC. What if we had just learned of an unknown period in our past between the Precambrian and Cambrian eras? We know this period today as the Ediacaran, a recently discovered era, yet it embodies the very birth of life on Earth. The fossils discovered at Ediacara in Australia date back to the end of the Precambrian Superan, the earliest and longest period in Earth's history spanning 4 billion years. It's also the least known, as there are very few direct testimonies of this remote era. With the discovery of the Ediacaran, we have succeeded in dusting off the vestiges of the past and unlocking the mystery of the Precambrian. In 1957, as the fossil study continued, a momentous event occurred in Charnwood, England. Among the rare and protected species found in the forest geological formations was the fossil Charnia mason. The latter visibly resembled text incomplete. It seems like the text is incomplete and the sentences are not properly finished, making it difficult to accurately place the punctuation in the given text. If you can provide the complete sentences or specific areas where you would like the punctuation to be added, I'd be more than happy to assist further. Fossils previously found in South Australia, notably in the Ediacara shales, and in Namibia in the 1930s, which then seemed devoid of any trace of life. Gradually, similar fossils were identified at around 25 sites around the world and grouped into 3 assemblages. The Avalon assemblage, located in Newfoundland, Canada, is the oldest and contains a significant number of atypical fossils. The Ediacara assemblage, named after the anonymous hills in Australia, groups together identical fossils preserved in riparian zones. The Charnia mason fossil, discovered in England in the 1950s, was the first species to be reliably associated with Ediacaran rocks. It has played an essential role in our understanding of the origin of the living world. Fossils previously detected in Australia were attributed to the Ediacaran period, giving us a valuable glimpse into an inert past at the beginning of the history of life on Earth. So from -635 to -541 million years BC, let's reconstruct the fascinating history of its name from the hills of Ediacara, where rock formations were first attributed to the Ediacaran geological period. The Ediacaran took place between the Precambrian super-eon and the Phanerozoic eon. It should be noted that the Ediacaran is sometimes called the late Neoproterozoic, being the last period of the Neoproterozoic, literally the era before animals. It was a unique and relatively long pivotal epoch in geological time, with around 94 million years of existence. The Ediacaran stands out from the inertia of earlier life in terms of geology and paleontology. It put an end to the Precambrian eon to mark the beginning of an incredibly rich period in the world of living things. This period saw the birth and extinction of the oldest known complex multicellular organisms. It was in fact the first mass extinction in Earth's history. This is why it is generally subdivided into two parts in the timescale, the lower Ediacaran and the upper Ediacaran. Note that this subdivision varies slightly depending on the geographic region studied. The lower Ediacaran corresponds to the first part of the Ediacaran period, which began around -635 million years BC and immediately played an essential role in the development of life on planet Earth. The late Ediacaran, on the other hand, represents the second part of this period and spans roughly between 580 and -541 million years ago, marking the end of the Ediacaran. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and see how the Ediacaran began. The only creatures in existence before the Ediacaran were unicellular and static, in other words, algae and cyanobacteria, photosynthetic organisms. These tiny creatures occupied the oceans and thrived without the need for oxygen. But how were the first complex creatures formed? How did the transition from the static microbes of the Precambrian to the fauna of the Ediacaran occur? In fact, it would seem that life eventually found its way in while the Earth was facing a major climatic crisis. When we speak of a unified Earth and a supercontinent, we usually mean Pangaea, but the continents have only linked and unlinked over billions of years. Pangaea was not the first supercontinent to form. At the very beginning of the Mesoproterozoic, a supercontinent called Columbia began to break up 1.6 billion years ago. Over time, the supercontinent Rodinia formed around 1.1 billion years ago. Fast forward a little further to the end of the Tonian, 750 million years ago, the continent of Rodinia, under the effect of hot spots, the Earth's crust then began to fracture, and this event was accompanied by the opening of oceans and inlets, which increased the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere and hence rainfall. The carbon present in the rain, in the form of carbon dioxide, soon found its way back into the ocean, trapped in sediments in the form of carbonates. At the same time, the enormous lava flows produced by the Rodinia fracture formed basaltic surfaces on the continents. When eroded by moisture, these basaltic surfaces consume 8 times more carbon than the same granitic surface. Over millions of years, atmospheric CO2, a greenhouse gas, decreases drastically, and the Earth enters a new period of extreme cold. 30 million years after the start of the fragmentation of Rodinia, the Tonian ends and the Cryogenian begins. Our planet underwent not one, but 2 ice ages during this period. Prior to the Ediacaran, the Earth had undergone successive episodes of glaciation, the most important of which was the Huronian glaciation, extending to the equator between -2.4 billion years ago and -2.1 billion years ago, earning it the nickname Snowball Earth. As the Ediacaran approached, more than 720 million years ago, the planet underwent a new period of planetary glaciation, with immense ice caps stretching across the globe. Rock analyses show a significant reduction in carbon content and hence in organic activity. Photosynthesis was also cut off. Over millions of years, bacteria have therefore suffered the full force of this glacial chaos. The ice cap could be heard hundreds of meters below the surface. At times, temperatures dropped as low as -50 degrees Celsius or -58 degrees Fahrenheit. Many bacteria did not survive, and the first algae probably also lost a significant number of specimens during this period of extreme cold. Yet snatches of life seem to have found refuges to survive this difficult period. One might think that this glaciation dealt a fatal blow to the evolution and expansion of life on Earth, but it would be a mistake to stop at this preconceived idea. Life is an eternal adaptation. That's what evolution is all about. Look at this little organism. It's a trophozoite. At first glance, it doesn't look like a highly evolved creature. Barely visible to the naked eye, it looks like a large group of organisms known as metazoans. Placozoans are ultimately metazoans with a particularly simple structure. Trophozoite has no head, tail, legs, or nervous system. It has no digestive tract, nor does it have extracellular digestion. It's hard to see how it can survive and qualify as a living organism, yet it has a body covered with cilia which it uses to move around. Its shape is rather unusual, and we know very little about it. Little deeper, we might find that trophozoite has only 4 different cell types. This confirms its place among simple organisms, and yet this little animal, along with others of its kind, has undoubtedly played an extremely important role in evolution. This little body contains the protein genes that enable the anteposterior, dorsoventral axes, and even 4 of the visual pigment genes. Imagine such a simple, primitive animal as one of the keys to the evolution of living things. It's not alone in this environment, since after the ice ages, algae developed extensively and spread throughout the world's oceans. Underwater waters became more vegetated. This intense glaciation, known as the Varanger glaciation, lasted 85 million years and ended 635 million years ago. This marked the end of the Cryogenian and the beginning of the Ediacaran. Rodinia was an immense supercontinent comprising North America, South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, Siberia, and other regions. All were grouped together in a single land mass. With such a configuration, the land masses were clustered near the poles, which would have contributed to intensified climatic cooling and larger ice caps. Furthermore, the relationship between the Ediacaran period and the supercontinent Rodinia is very close. Although, to pave the way for the Ediacaran, the supercontinent had to fracture into 8 pieces 750 million years ago. By the time of the Ediacaran, Rodinia had already been fracturing for almost 120 million years. And if you remember, Ediacaran fossils have been found in regions that are currently far apart, such as Australia, England, and Namibia. Since Rodinia was already fragmented, Ediacaran animals from 600 million years ago could not have traveled such great distances. They potentially lived on the margins of a single continent, Pannotia, a hypothetical supercontinent that emerged from the fragmentation of Rodinia and would have existed from 600 to 540 million years ago. At the dawn of the Ediacaran, cold and ice gave way to a warmer climate. This rapid transition coincided with a significant increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, which probably led to abrupt warming. The presence of ash, basalt, and other volcanic rock deposits on the Ediacaran group supports the idea that potential volcanic eruptions occurred and contributed to the emission of greenhouse gases, which would explain the high presence of carbon dioxide. Following these events, the atmosphere was rich in carbon dioxide, which would have led to the gradual thawing of the Earth. As a result, the melted ice caps and glaciers would have flowed into the ocean, causing the sea levels of the time to rise. And since temperatures were warmer, the oceans would have undergone evaporation, which logically generated humidity in the atmosphere. Contrary to appearances, this climatic catastrophe was a godsend. It led to a major diversification of living organisms. When the thaw starts, a whole chain of reactions ensues. The erosion of continents as the ice melts is said to be responsible for the release of vast quantities of nutrients. This abundance of nutrients encourages the expansion and proliferation of phytoplankton. These Precambrian cyanobacteria, operating through the mechanism of photosynthesis, transformed light energy into chemical energy. They stored light in glucose, an energy-generating substance for later use. Gradually, anaerobic microorganisms began to absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen in the atmosphere, releasing large quantities of oxygen into the atmosphere. At that time, life was still confined to water. The molecules that make up living matter are photosensitive. They could be destroyed if subjected to certain types of radiation, notably ultraviolet. 600 million years ago, thanks to the significant release of oxygen into the air, ozone was formed and accumulated naturally in the stratosphere. This molecule, composed of 3 oxygen atoms, O3, absorbs ultraviolet rays, protecting living organisms. The ozone layer's first concentration threshold is reached, heading to an explosion in marine diversity. Ozone is favorable to the development of life above 15 kilometers or 9 miles altitude, but it is particularly oxidizing and dangerous in the air around us. All these events culminated 575 million years ago in the Avalon explosion. Moisture and increased oxygen levels encouraged the development of the first complex life forms, creating a marine ecosystem and a natural habitat conducive to biodiversity. New multicellular organisms with aerobic respiration mechanisms replaced single-cell microbes. It was at this point that the major event of the Ediacaran era took place, the Avalon explosion or Ediacaran explosion, characterized by the emergence of mobile creatures that roamed the oceans before dying out forever. But between their first appearance and their extinction, a whole new life had manifested itself. The remains of the Avalon explosion can be seen in Newfoundland, where an ancient fossil site suggests that multicellular organisms were living 50 kilometers or 30 miles away at the time. This site illustrates the evolutionary radiation that took place around 575 million years ago, marked by a rapid morphological diversification in complex macroscopic multicellular organisms, referred to as the Ediacaran fauna. In this period, Neoproterozoic microorganisms contributed to the development and diversification of life on Earth by progressively oxygenating the atmosphere. In return, the increase in oxygen levels favored the development of new, more complex organisms. This evolution took place in two stages in parallel with the formation of the ozone layer. Life before the formation of the ozone layer was subject to intense exposure to the sun's harmful X-rays and ultraviolet rays. These UV rays, particularly intense and unfiltered, can damage organic molecules, notably DNA. This DNA damage can lead to mutations, cell dysfunction, and even the death of organisms. In such an environment, life would have found it difficult to develop complex structures and evolve beyond simple forms. So for a long time, life on Earth remained primitive, limited mainly to single-cell microorganisms that could survive despite these extreme conditions. But with the gradual formation of the ozone layer, which was not yet fully filtered, organisms faced challenges inherent in their development. For this reason, some Ediacaran specimens have been observed to be carpet or leaf-shaped. However, around 600 million years ago, the situation began to change as oxygen levels in the atmosphere rose. A stable ozone layer began to form, offering vital protection against UV radiation. This created a window of opportunity for life. With the UV threat largely eliminated, life was able to explore new evolutionary pathways, leading to increased diversity and complexity. It's important to remember that Ediacaran animals were not as developed and complex as today's animals, such as fish, insects, or the more ancient dinosaurs. Ediacaran fauna included organisms that bore no resemblance to any modern animal. Generally speaking, they were multicellular creatures of varying sizes. To this day, their classification remains a matter of debate. Strictly speaking, they cannot be defined as animals, but they certainly represent the first complex living beings to form on planet Earth. Be that as it may, the Ediacaran ecosystem has witnessed the emergence of a variety of specimens with highly diversified diets and lifestyles. The fauna of the Ediacaran lived exclusively in the ocean, as the ozone layer was not yet thick enough to allow life on land. For this, we'd have to wait almost 200 million years for the first plants to emerge from the water, at around 450 million years, and several tens of millions more to see the first land animals. For the time being, life consists of large and varied multicellular creatures, unlike Precambrian organisms, which were static, microscopic in size, and lacking in diversity. These new creatures would have developed in the Proterozoic ocean, which formed during the Neoproterozoic following the fragmentation of the ancient supercontinent Rodinia. During the Ediacaran, this ocean occupied a central position, dividing the continental fragments that would later give rise to future continents such as Laurentia and Baltica. The Proterozoic ocean, stretched from the south to the north of Gondwana, formed during the Ediacaran and containing the continents of today: Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, part of North America, and India. This is why Gondwana is also considered a supercontinent. Now that we have a glimpse of the environment that welcomed the first Ediacaran creatures, let's take a look at their appearance. Some fossils resemble jellyfish, while others are impossible to classify among the biological groups we know. In any case, most Ediacaran fossils are even referred to as Ediacaran feathers. Other creatures are oval-shaped. All in all, most Ediacaran organisms were soft, flat, and lacked a hard external skeleton, making their preservation relatively rare. As it contains unfossilized fossils, this may seem paradoxical, but it's true. The concept of traditional fossilization is defined by the preservation of hard bodies, shells, bones, etc., in mineral stones such as amber or any other organic material. However, the Ediacaran fossils were soft, boneless, making them difficult to preserve. The fossils found were wrapped in a thin film of organic matter, less than 3 micrometers thick. That said, the sedimentary layers overlaying Ediacaran creatures often contain the presence of biofilms. This suggests that the organic film preserving Ediacaran organisms may have been formed through the contribution of microbial biofilms. Colonies of bacteria, algae, fungi, and other types of small unicellular organisms probably secreted substances that stuck to sand and mud to form a kind of carpet on the seabed surface. We can then assume that Ediacaran organisms lived under or around these biofilms, and when some of the Ediacaran organisms died, their remains fell to the seabed where they were gradually covered by sedimentary particles stuck together by the biofilms. Over time, the sedimentary layers containing the fossils of the Ediacaran organisms and the fossilized biofilms gradually compacted under the pressure of the upper layers. These sediments turned into rock, preserving the organisms inside these rock formations. To recapitulate, biofilms did not directly cover Ediacaran organisms, but they did play an environmental role by stabilizing marine sediments and providing an environment conducive to the preservation of Ediacaran fauna. Footprints, as they would have undergone rapid fossilization in fine sediments rich in specific minerals, their state of preservation is almost miraculous, which is why the Ediacaran fauna is so fascinating. Now that we know a little more about the preservation characteristics of Ediacaran fauna remains, let's get to know the most emblematic animals of the Ediacaran biota. Let's start with the first Ediacaran fossil found in Charnwood Forest, the Charnia. The discovery of the Charnia is exceptional in that it paved the way for studies of Ediacaran creatures, thanks to which we know how they contributed to the creation of today's world. Charnia was a marine organism living on the ocean floor. It is described as a branched organism given its tree-like structure. This arborescent organism had a form of fronds that propagated it in the same way as branches. In fact, it is one of the fossils known as the Ediacaran feathers. Fossil records indicate that Charnia mason could extend over several tens of centimeters or inches, but other Charnia specimens vary widely in size. Like Charnia, Swartpuntia also belongs to the Ediacaran leaf family. These fossils form two groups, the fractal-shaped frondomorphs and the simpler anamorphs. Generally speaking, Swartpuntia have a fleecy appearance rather like an inflatable mattress and are on average between 5 and 20 centimeters long or around 4 inches. Aspidella discs have been found in many geological formations around the world dating back to the Ediacaran period and are among the most emblematic groups of Ediacaran fauna. Let's continue our tour to discover the Aspidella. The Aspidella is characterized by its disc or cup shape. It has a slightly depressed center and raised edges. In addition, Aspidella discs range from a few millimeters to several centimeters in diameter. Like Charnia and Aspidella, Dickinsonia is also one of the earliest fossils discovered, notably in the Ediacaran deposits of Siberia's White Sea. It was a rather flat, oval-shaped organism. It could sometimes take the shape of a disc, a tire, or even resemble a carpet. Like the Charnia, the Dickinsonia could extend to several dozen centimeters in length. Spindle-shaped fossils of this species have been found in Australia and Russia. That said, the spindle was a small organism. It had an elongated, sinuous appearance. In
just
fact,
like its
why
shape is
Iaspis,
somewhat similar.
another organism discovered in China in 2019 and thought to have lived between 555 and 539 million years BC. This vermiform fossil measures 27 centimeters or 11 in long and has a well-defined head and tail. It is possible that this organism is the ancestor of animals such as insects, mollusks, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and so on. Most importantly, Iolaeoborus bears a striking resemblance to animals that appeared in the Cambrian. Was the Cambrian explosion less sudden than most fossils suggest? Only time will tell. Finally, fossils of another soft organism have also been discovered, this time exclusively in Russia. These are the fossils of Kimbrella, an oval creature that resembles a slug or gastropod and is sometimes associated with mollusks. Fossils of this creature are often incomplete. It is, therefore, difficult to determine its exact size, but it is estimated that Kimbrella could have been a few millimeters long. The fossil samples found indicate that the Ediacaran fauna included, for the most part, frondomorphs and fronds. Among the dozens of groups identified, this may seem a meager collection, but the presence of arboreal, flat, and round creatures of varying sizes represents an immense evolution. Let's not forget that before the Ediacaran organisms were microscopic. In addition to Ediacaran leaves and discs, it's likely that sponges also existed during this period. In fact, a fossil found in Namibia named Otavia appears to have an early form of the sponge. It would have arisen during the Ediacaran, as it was found in the Precambrian geological rocks of AMA. What's more, although it lacks a digestive or nervous system, this organism seems more closely related to animals than to plants or fungi. So it's possible that Otavia is a sponge. However, without further proof, the emergence and evolution of typically Ediacaran sponges remain controversial. Research continues and may provide us with new information on their possible existence in the Ediacaran. Let's turn now to Cladina, a small Ediacaran fossil distinguished by its shells. The organism consists of several interlocking conical shells, and contrary to what you might think, the shells of Cladina species were not made of bone, but of mineral segments. They surrounded the organism, providing support or protection. There's more to come. In 2007, a long silhouette surrounded by a variety of fossils appeared on a sloping rock face at Charnwood. After thorough examination, the 20 centimeters or 8 in tall creature finally offers some explanation as to its assemblage and position. Luminous in appearance and evoking the idea of a bright light like the aurora borealis, the creature found is named Aal lumina Tanner and is thought to be around 560 million years old. It is thought to be a precursor of the Narian, the group of jellyfish, corals, and anemones with its flame-like tentacles. Aura lumina resembled an Olympic torch. Moreover, its positioning suggests that it captured its prey using its stinging cells. Finally, Aurora lumina is potentially the oldest animal predator known to date. Although Ediacaran organisms are characterized by the absence of skeletons, Aurora lumina is the epitome of the great diversity and evolution of the Ediacaran biota. It is one of the Ediacaran species with rigid, resistant body structures, probably the primitive forms of skeletons. Doesn't this testify to the diversity, even complexity, of the life forms that flourished during the Ediacaran? Proof too of the multitude of morphological and anatomical through the ages in the Ediacaran, flora was not yet highly developed. Although algae are generally classified as aquatic flora, this classification does not necessarily reflect their true phylogenetic position among living organisms. It's also worth noting that algae existed long before the Ediacaran, since traces of them can be traced back over 3 billion years. On the other hand, some specimens provide insight into the early diversification of the plant kingdom and the composition of Precambrian ecosystems, such as the case of the Protorachodium senji. These 3D preserved fossils were discovered in Shandong Province, central China, around 541 million years ago. But this green algae is not a direct ancestor of today's land plants. By the end of the Ediacaran, these organisms had already split off from the branch that would later give rise to land plants. This discovery suggests, however, that this split probably took place earlier than previously thought. Protorachodium senji has a central structure made up of tangled tubes and small, tightly packed structures around them, which are similar to the plants known as bryopsidales. We learned that during the Ediacaran, different groups of organisms suddenly appeared. In addition to being extremely well preserved, the fossils discovered are also. Let's find out what Ediacaran fossils tell us about life during this period. We'll explore how Ediacaran fauna contributed to the evolution of biodiversity and the creation of a new marine ecosystem at that time. The vast majority of living creatures lived in shallow seas. Based on the findings of Ediacaran fossils, we can deduce that there was a transitional interval of several million years between the emergence and development of complex organisms. We know that the first Ediacaran organisms were immobile and attached to rocks, shells, marine substrates, and other hard surfaces. Yet we have found traces of nutrients inside their fossils, which means that the Ediacaran fauna was feeding. Being unable to move, Ediacaran sessile organisms drew their food directly from their environment, thanks to their feather-like branches. Although they didn't have the same digestive systems as today's animals, we noted that most still had structures similar to a mouth and intestine. Well, except for the Charnia and Swartpuntia, which had none. But let's not forget that the latter were probably the first complex organisms to emerge on Earth. It's logical that they hadn't yet developed such anatomical features at such an early date. Moreover, Charnia and Swartpuntia were probably photosynthetic organisms. They fed on the energy they produced by absorbing sunlight. They may also have filtered organic particles from the water. Then, it seems that the first animals had a simple diet, even if their concept of eating a meal differed from ours, and as competitors and predators did not yet exist, at least during most of the Ediacaran. The ocean environment was surely rich in microscopic-sized nutrients, including organic carbon, a nutrient detected on several Ediacaran fossils. In 2018, deposits resembling what could be the first real fossilized meal were found in Russia, in the intestine of Kimberella. After multiple analyses, it turned out that this meal was made up of phytosterol molecules, a substance derived from algae and bacteria present in the ocean during the Ediacaran. It seems that Kimberella fed by scraping and tearing the algae covering the seabed, and seaweed is full of nutrients. This explains why the Ediacaran biota was so much larger and more complex than its predecessors, since Ediacaran fauna fed differently to Precambrian microscopic and unicellular organisms. Now in 2023, a new study is underway to assess the intestinal content of 3 more Ediacaran fossils. From lipids, the information obtained from the lipids preserved in the fossils could provide further clues as to how these animals fed. Indeed, preserved lipid biomarkers offer a unique insight into the biology of fossil organisms. Perhaps we'll soon know more about what animals ate during the Ediacaran. Ediacaran animals were complex even in their motor skills. Most were fixed to marine substrates, yet signs of movement were revealed. Some fossil footprints found in the hills of Ediacara and progressively in different parts of the world visibly include traces of footsteps and movements, probably belonging to organisms developed during the second part of the Ediacaran. These remains tell us about the activity of the Ediacara biota and provide valuable information to better understand the evolution of animals during this period. What's more, we've observed fossil footprints on the sediments that resemble tunnels or excavated paths. If Ediacaran organisms couldn't move, how can we explain the formation of these fossil paths? In addition to tunnels, in 2018, an organism thought to have lived 550 million years ago was found in large numbers in Australia's Nilpana National Park in Ediacara, resembling a small, twisted donut and measuring around 1 centimeter in diameter. The organism has been named Obamas coronatus in honor of former U.S. President Barack Obama. In addition, the Obamas coronatus fossils discovered were surrounded by at least 2 different species. Among the organisms found near Obamas coronatus, we have Triberchidium and Rugosulconites. The Triberchidium and Rugosulconites fossils are also strikingly shaped. They are larger than Obamas coronatus and have triradial symmetry, strange features specific to the Ediacaran fauna. That said, 3 different species were found in the same place. Therefore, some Ediacaran organisms did indeed have the ability to move and reach new areas of the seabed. Incidentally, the Obamus coronatus fossils date back 550 million years, so sessile Ediacaran organisms would indeed have developed the ability to move around in the latter part of this period. What's more, we've seen how Ediacaran animals fed, and we've also learned that they were able to move around. But how can we explain their diversification? Clues as to the mechanism of reproduction in Ediacaran animals, but some fossils have potentially reproductive structures, such as tubular or disc-shaped fossils. It would also be important to continue studying fossil records to gain a better understanding of this fascinating period in Earth's history. It seems that some of the organisms had asexual or sexual reproduction methods. However, the question of reproduction is a subject of intense research, opening the field to various interpretations. In-depth studies or the discovery of more direct data are needed to obtain precise answers. The Ediacaran period had to retain some of its mystery, like their reproductive methods. We know very little about the ecological interactions between Ediacaran organisms. From the traces we have found, we assume that an ecological system would have existed. Anyway, each species seems to have occupied a specific trophic level, and the organisms must have lived in perfect symbiosis. In any case, they didn't eat each other since they had practically the same food source. Thus, we can see that the Ediacaran biota was characterized by interdependence and an absence of predation between most Ediacaran organisms for most of this period, well until the appearance of the aurora lumina. What we know today about the Ediacaran environment and life comes from the interpretation of stratigraphic layers known as the Ediacaran group. This succession of layers is made up of sediments accumulated on the ocean floor at the time, composed of mudstones, sandstones, and limestones. These sediments have been an invaluable aid to science, enabling us to reconstruct the geological history of the Ediacaran period. These sedimentary successions are, to say the least, disconcerting. Each stratum is distinct from the next, both in size and shape. Some layers are horizontal, others inclined or folded. This is probably the impact of tectonic activity on the rocks over time. What's more, the fossilized organisms found in the Ediacaran group were also arranged in different orientations. Their position tells us about their lifestyle, behavior, and ecological interaction during the Ediacaran. Although the Ediacaran period played a major role in the evolution of today's world, the Earth is far from what it was then. This period had distinct geological characteristics compared to today. We've already discussed the factors that contributed to the transition from the primitive world to the beginning of highly organized life. Now let's discover the configuration of the continents and watersheds that existed during the Ediacaran. As we have already learned, the supercontinent Pannotia was formed by the fragmentation of Rodinia as a result of various geological processes. But its existence was short-lived, and it too began to fragment. As with Rodinia, the continental masses of Pannotia fragmented and dispersed following their own trajectory, due in part to the opening of an ocean called Iapetus. Some Pannosian land masses ended up in the Earth's southern hemisphere, while others moved to other parts of the globe. Tectonic activity, erosion, sediment accumulation, and the formation of the first continental shelves, the sedimentary deposits of the Ediacaran period exerted pressure on the older sedimentary layers below. This played a role in the construction of the new land masses. Gradually, the sedimentary basins were filled with deposits of minerals, organic debris, and fossils, and transformed into rock layers, compacting and lithifying. While these continental rocks were thickening, they were melting, leading to the closure of eventual oceans, such as the pre-Ediacaran Prototethys Ocean. After the breakup of the supercontinents Rodinia and Pannotia, a huge landmass emerged called Gondwana following a series of orogenic events, including the Pan-African orogeny around 600 million years ago. As a reminder, Gondwana encompassed Antarctica, South America, Australia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. At the same time, emerging platforms had transformed landscapes and provided habitats conducive to the growth and flourishing of life, especially marine life. The dispersal of the Pannosian land masses contributed to the Earth's changing geological and geographical configuration. During the Ediacaran period, huge expanses of water, probably oceans, covered most of the planet, and water currents were impacted. All we know is that the bodies of water were shallow and rich in nutrients. The seabed was covered with organic matter, the thickness of which varied from zone to zone, and they would have been warmer than today's oceans. The configuration of the continents was also constantly changing during the Ediacaran as tectonic processes progressed. The dislocated and dispersed land masses of the supercontinents gave rise to new continents and at least one ocean. The Iapetus Ocean surrounded the supercontinent Rodinia and would have preceded the formation of the Pan-African Ocean. This, in turn, gave way to the Panthalastic Ocean, but we're not there yet. It was in this ocean that Ediacaran organisms appeared around 600 million years ago. The Ediacaran is known for its coastal environments, lagoons, and shallow areas of the ocean. It is also possible that seas or small marine basins coexisted in parallel at this time. Whatever the case, the ocean waters of the Ediacaran were different from those of today. In fact, these waters had the same characteristics as those of the epicontinental seas, with a chemical composition specific to the Ediacaran. In other words, they were shallow and low in oxygen compared with today's levels. Finally, Morovia, being the only known ocean of the early Ediacaran after the closure of Protus and before the appearance of Iapetus, probably surrounded the continental fragments of Rodinia and Anotia. In this sense, its size would have been immense, covering a large part of the Earth's surface, but not for long. The ocean's configuration then depended on the shape of the land masses emerging as a result of tectonic movements. Moreover, the continued presence of the Morovia Ocean is uncertain. It may have disappeared over time due to geological processes or been subducted beneath a possible continental plate. To date, it is difficult to draw definite conclusions about the fate of the Morovia Ocean. Due to plate tectonics, the Earth had to undergo multiple active geological processes during the Ediacaran before taking on the shape we know today, starting with rifting and the formation of sedimentary basins. The Ediacaran period saw several episodes of rifting on both sides of the globe. This involved continental fracturing, a process in which the Earth's crust cracks, creating collapsed trenches. As a result of tectonic movements, the continental shelves would have drifted apart. As a result, the Angara Basin was formed at the level of the East Siberian Sea. This was followed by another rifting event in the Adelaide Basin in South Australia. These basins contain extensive sedimentary deposits, providing us with information on the environmental and geological conditions of the Ediacaran period. Finally, volcanic traces have also been found in the fossil footprints, suggesting that volcanoes skirted the rifting zones, releasing magma that would have risen and solidified. In this way, submarine mountain ranges would have formed as the plates separated, reshaping the configuration of the planet and seabed. The early Ediacaran would have seen three supercontinents. Rodinia was already in the process of breaking up, Pannotia was in place for a short time, and Gondwana fragmented. While Rodinia and Pannotia were in the process of fragmenting, Gondwana, on the other hand, developed. During the Ediacaran period, between the end of the Neoproterozoic and the beginning of the Paleozoic, from there the supercontinent, like its predecessors, gradually broke up into several land masses. As a result, three Ediacaran continents were formed: Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia. Incidentally, there were probably other smaller terrestrial fragments, but we know no more about them. In any case, we do know that the Ediacaran witnessed the fragmentation of three supercontinents and the evolution of at least three distinct continents. These new continents did not take place with any regular frequency. The principle has been the same since the dawn of time, with the separation of Earth's crust occurring as a result of tectonic movements, whether plate divergence, platform collision, or rifting. In any case, the creation of continents has always been a continuous process. Some continents break up, others form and evolve over time. It's also worth noting that the formation of the three Ediacaran continents set the stage for future major events, including the Cambrian explosion. During the Ediacaran, the Laurentia continent was located in the northern hemisphere. It played an important role in the creation of North America, corresponding to Canada and the United States. Gradually, other continents formed around Laurentia. It's worth noting that the hypothetical ocean Morovia potentially lay to the east of the Laurentia continent, separating it from the other land masses forming at the time. The second continent formed during the Ediacaran is the Baltic continent. This included the northern regions of Europe, including Scandinavia and parts of Russia. The third continent, Siberia, is also known as the Angora Craton. During the Ediacaran period, it encompassed Siberia and Russia and was positioned to the east of the two continents, Laurentia and Baltia. In addition, following the fragmentation of the supercontinents, the Iapetus Ocean was formed, separating Baltica from the two continents of Laurentia and Siberia. Influenced by geological processes such as tectonic shifts and continental collisions, Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia all contributed to the creation of terrestrial landscapes and the diversification of biological environments, both during and after the Ediacaran. In addition to these three continents, geological research suggests the existence of other land masses during the Ediacaran. As this is a very early period, the lack of further evidence means that until now, we have no further details as to their position or size. However, they would probably have been smaller based on tectonic models, fossil analyses, and the rocks used for geological studies. In any case, geological and paleontological research continues apace, regularly revealing new information and enriching our knowledge of past eras. We're certainly not immune to new fossil discoveries, and will certainly know more in the near future about the complete configuration of continents and land masses during and at the end of the Ediacaran. The three continents mentioned above were also involved in other tectonic movements during the Ediacaran. In addition to rifting, the Earth underwent other geological processes, including a series of orogenic events. Orogeny is the reverse process of rifting, corresponding to the creation of mountains as a result of the uplift of the Earth's crust and the movement of tectonic plates. Like the Appalachian Mountains, which were formed around 400 million years ago after the Ediacaran following subduction of the Prototus Ocean. In any case, during the Ediacaran, the Appalachian mountain range did not yet have its present configuration. At the time, these mountains constituted the margins of the separate Rodinia continent. For the reasons given above, just before the Ediacaran, a series of orogenic events took place, giving rise to the supercontinent of Gondwana and Penosa around 600 million years ago. This is the Pan-African orogeny that gave rise to the Pan-African mountain range, system of all Africa and beyond, to cite a few examples of orogenesis during the Ediacaran. The Caledonian orogeny, which took place between 650 and 550 million years BC, was only a short segment of the immense Pan-African chain. A Paleozoic terrain would then have subducted beneath the Gondwana supercontinent, triggering the Cadomian orogeny that can be seen on buried rocks all over southern Britain between 600 and 500 million years BC. South Australia also underwent tectonic activity, triggering the Adelaide orogeny, which also gave rise to mountains and basins. Other orogenic events then occurred on the southern and eastern margins of another Ediacaran continent, Laurentia. These include the Iberian orogeny in Africa and the Speco-Norwegian orogeny in Western Europe. Last but not least, Baltica was also affected by tectonic movements that paved the way for later orogenies, the best known of which is the Caledonian orogeny, leading to the formation of the mountain chain of the same time would have been influenced by the division of Rodinia, Penosa, and Gondwana, modifying the landscape and climate. The dislocation of the continents had thus favored the emergence of the Ediacaran and the diversification of its organisms. Then the tables turned during the latter part of the Ediacaran. In fact, the Nama geological series shows that between -550 and 541 million years BC, over 80% of the Ediacaran fauna had unexpectedly died out. The discovery of the Ediacaran fauna was essential in identifying the origin of our world. Thanks to traces dating back hundreds of millions of years, we have been able to reconstruct the Earth's history and discover all the events that have in one way or another shaped our present. Yet here we are at the end of the Ediacaran, a geological period that spanned 94 million years, an exciting era marked by the development of the first complex organisms. While the early Ediacaran was marked by the development of the first complex organisms, it was only at the end of this period that these organisms changed and took on more complex forms before becoming extinct. The Earth has experienced several episodes of mass extinction over the course of its history, involving a considerable loss of biodiversity and impacting the evolution of life forms on Earth. The exact number of mass extinctions is still a matter of debate, but we currently count 5 major mass extinctions. These are the Ordovician-Silurian extinction, which occurred around 443 million years ago; the Devonian extinction, around 359 million years ago; the Permian-Triassic extinction, about 252 million years ago; the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, occurring around 201.1 million years ago; and the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, occurring around 66 million years ago. Finally, with the discovery of the Ediacaran, we learn that there is a 6th, which in turn turns out to be the first. The Ediacaran extinction was recently identified as the first biological crisis of all time, adding to the 5 previously mentioned extinctions. As a result, the Ediacaran fauna disappeared, fortunately leaving traces behind, but alas, almost no descendants. Then, around 541 million years ago, due to a drastic decline in biodiversity, between 80% and 95% of Ediacaran organisms became extinct. It is thought that Iolaus Bacophorus may have been part of the minority that survived, having appeared 10 million years before the Cambrian and resembling Cambrian organisms to boot. In any case, isn't it strange to see the majority of Ediacaran species become extinct overnight? What's more mysterious are the causes of this extinction, which remain uncertain to this day. Ultimately, the disappearance of the Ediacaran fauna is as enigmatic as its appearance. The Ediacaran extinction, also known as the Ediacaran-Cambrian extinction, is a major event that shook up the story of life on Earth and challenged our understanding of the evolution of the animal kingdom. Moreover, this biological crisis can be attributed to various types of change. The precise causes of the end of the Ediacaran remain a matter of debate. That said, it would appear that environmental and climatic changes are the most plausible causes. The Ediacaran was marked by several cycles of climatic cooling and warming, impacted by changes in the Earth's orbit. Such fluctuations would probably have been detrimental to animal life at the time, for example, by disrupting survival and nutrient availability, among other things. Let's not forget that Ediacaran organisms were the first living beings. They would have been particularly sensitive and not really adapted to cataclysmic changes. On the other hand, the Ediacaran period saw several intense volcanic eruptions, with the formation and fracturing of various supercontinents. This volcanic activity could also have played a role in the extinction of Ediacaran fauna. Volcanoes release large quantities of gases into the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. When these gases come into contact with water, they are transformed into sulfuric acid. It is therefore assumed that by invading the oceans, it would have affected marine organisms. In addition to contaminating ocean waters, volcanic fumes can also prevent sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, leading to global cooling. In this respect, traces of glaciation indicate that a second climate crisis occurred towards the end of the Ediacaran. From beginning to end, the Ediacaran was marked by extreme conditions. The beginning of the Ediacaran bears the imprint of global warming, while its end experienced a dramatic cooling episode. But global warming did have a positive effect on the planet. It has greatly contributed to the evolution of life on Earth. On the other hand, the episode of glaciation, due to the drastic drop in atmospheric temperatures, was catastrophic. Temperatures averaged between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius, 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. On the other hand, the second part of the Ediacaran would have had the opposite effect. Temperatures would have plummeted between 0 degrees Celsius and minus 20 degrees Celsius, or dropped between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on. The spread of carbon dioxide indeed altered the atmosphere's chemical composition, but tectonic movements and interactions between the ocean and atmosphere may have also contributed to the second Ediacaran climate crisis. Around 579 million years ago, extreme glaciation occurred during the Great Gaskier's glaciation. This period led to the formation of ice caps in certain regions and the discovery of sediment and rock deposits left behind by glaciers. These deposits have been found in polar regions and at latitudes around 30 degrees to 10 degrees from the equator. The drastic drop in temperatures resulted in the trapping of considerable quantities of ocean water in the form of ice, thus lowering sea levels and impacting the natural habitats of Ediacaran fauna. Between the two Ediacaran climatic crises, the period experienced numerous fluctuations and precipitation variations, leading to the formation of lakes, rivers, and deltas in some regions, while others experienced arid conditions. The Great Gaskier's glaciation was significant, but not to the extent of causing another snowball Earth event. However, this ultimate climatic shift was likely the cause of the end of the Ediacaran period, as most Ediacaran organisms would not have withstood such extreme cold. It is noteworthy that oxygen levels were not stable at the end of the Ediacaran following glaciation, and the number of oxygen-producing organisms fluctuated as well. Decreased, however, during the early late Ediacaran, oxygen levels were higher than during the late Ediacaran. But it wasn't an increased oxygenation that closed the curtain on this geological period. As it happens, a hypoxic environment prevailed at the end of the Ediacaran, meaning that oxygen levels were once again low, just as they were at the beginning. Given that Ediacaran organisms were all aerobic, not receiving the necessary oxygen supply could have been fatal. Finally, there is no evidence for a total absence of oxygen at the end of the Ediacaran. Apart from the fact that certain sedimentary rocks observed in southern China were surrounded by zones rich in iron, but considerably lacking in oxygen. That's why we prefer to use the term hypoxic rather than anoxic. Be that as it may, some of the minority of Ediacaran survivors were larger, notably the fronds, whose size also reflects a potential drop in oxygen in the water. The larger surface area of the fronds would have enabled them to survive in such harsh conditions. In other words, some organisms would have adapted to the lack of oxygen in order to thrive, developing a maximum proportion of cells in direct contact with seawater. On the other hand, some marine organisms are said to have gradually transformed themselves into predators, as illustrated by the behavior of the aurora lumina or the Cambrella, which displays characteristics similar to those of a grazer. It is assumed that it disrupted the microbial substrate to feed on defenseless Ediacaran organisms and surrounding biofilms. Moreover, primitive predators, employing a variety of means to feed, also use perforation as a method of hunting. In fact, we have found traces of drilling on Clodina shells. It is therefore plausible that the appearance of the first animal predators would have endangered the lives of the Ediacaran survivors, most of whom were sessile, non-predatory species. Perhaps the Ediacaran became extinct as a result of tectonic upheaval. The Earth has not remained the same over the eons, but it has always been subject to the same rules. It never stops moving, undergoing inevitable geological changes over time. By undergoing frequent environmental changes, it is likely that the Earth would eventually have reached the limits of its resilience. Recurrent and relentless plate tectonics might well have tested the biodiversity and ecosystems of this fascinating period in the history of life. Thus, fluctuating oxygen levels, climatic variations, and geological movements are likely factors in the Ediacaran extinction. Nevertheless, scientific research into the Ediacaran continues, and new discoveries may soon be made. Witnessing the development of life and preceding the Cambrian explosion, the Ediacaran was an important period marked by major events. The Ediacaran was a key stage in the birth of complex life, but other major events are yet to come to change the course of life's history. Let's not prolong the suspense any longer. Let's continue our journey through time with the following video. Let's discover the Cambrian, the period that follows the Ediacaran.